Odysseus begins his story with the famous tale of the Cyclops' cave. In this video, we will talk about what Odysseus does right, what he does wrong, and what it all means in the bigger picture. Hello and welcome back. My name is Zachary May, and today we are reading the great books of Western civilization together, continuing with the Odyssey. I'm using the Robert Fagel's translation, and we'll start with a summary of Book 9. The stranger responds at last to King Alcinous' questions. He praises the hospitality and the feast of his host's halls as the best that life can offer. Lamenting the anguish he will go through in recounting his tale, he begins by naming himself as Odysseus, son of Laertes, known to the world for every kind of craft, from Ithaca, to which he wishes, ultimately, to return. He tells of how he and his men sailed away from Troy to a nearby city, Ismarus, and sacked it just like they had Troy. His men insisted on feasting on site afterward, allowing them to be ambushed by reinforcements from further inland. Most of the fleet escaped, only to be driven far off course by a series of storms. On the 12th day since fleeing Ismarus, Odysseus and his men arrived at the land of the Lotus Eaters. He sent 3 scouts to see what kind of people lived there, and if they were friend or foe. The Lotus Eaters provided his men with the lotus fruit, which caused them to forget who they were, their journey home, leaving them only with the desire to sit and eat of the lotus. Odysseus himself rescues these men by hauling them back to the ship himself before departing. Next, the fleet arrives at an island just offshore from the land of the Cyclopses. This is a land untouched by any kind of human cultivation, where the Cyclops live on just what they slaughter and gather each day. Odysseus takes his own ship to scout out the inhabitants of the island and finds the cave of Polyphemus, a loner amongst the Cyclops. He brings his 12 best fighting men and a skin of strong wine as he investigates. Odysseus waits in the cave with his men for the giant to return, intent on seeing if he will honor his obligations as a host and give them a gift. Polyphemus finally arrives with his flocks at the end of the workday, bringing his herds of sheep inside and rolling a huge stone over the entrance to the cave. He finally notices his guests and demands that they tell him who they are. Odysseus begs him for hospitality by Zeus, protector of strangers. The Cyclops scoffs at this before asking Odysseus where his ship is. Odysseus lies, saying that his ship was wrecked on rocks off the coast. Upon hearing that they have no one waiting for them and no escape, the Cyclops immediately seizes 2 of Odysseus's men, kills them, and eats them. He then stretches out to sleep. Odysseus considers killing the giant in his sleep before realizing that he is the only one who can move the great rock away from the entrance. The next day, after Polyphemus takes his flocks outside to pasture, leaving the men trapped in the cave, Odysseus and his men work together to whittle a sharp stake that they then hide amongst the dirt floor of the cave. When the giant returns, Odysseus tells him that his name is Nobody, before offering him a drink of the wine that he had brought with him. This wine is meant to be diluted, but the giant drinks it all without any water and passes out soon after. Odysseus and his men seize the moment and drive the stake that they had hidden into the giant's eye, blinding him. Polyphemus calls to the neighboring Cyclopses to come and help him, but they leave when they are told that nobody has hurt him. The giant opens his cave the next morning as usual, but places his hand across the entrance, allowing him to feel whether what passes by is a sheep or one of the men trying to escape. The men then lash themselves to the bellies of the sheep, allowing them to escape untouched and undetected. Once outside, they return to their ship. As they push off and sail away, Odysseus calls out to the giant, mocking him and revealing his true name. Polyphemus then hurls a huge rock into the ocean, barely missing Odysseus' ship, before calling out to Poseidon, his father, to curse Odysseus to never reach home, or if he must reach home, to only come after many years, broken and alone. Odysseus and his men sacrifice to Zeus to try to avert this curse, but he tells his audience that it did not work. Before we begin this next phase of the Odyssey, in which Odysseus tells us all that happened to him since leaving Troy, it's important to talk about how, for the first time, we are not hearing the story through an omniscient narrator. We're going through multiple chapters in which what we are being told is exactly what Odysseus is saying. Homer is not telling us what happened, Odysseus is. Thus, the way that he describes something may not be the way that an objective observer may. Does this matter? Maybe, maybe not. let's remember that Homer is ultimately still in control, and is just as much in charge of drawing our attention to what he thinks is important as Odysseus is. A great example of this overlap between Odysseus and Homer's voices is at the very end of the chapter, when Odysseus claims that Zeus plotted disaster for him and his men. At this point in the story, there's no reason for Odysseus to believe that Zeus has anything against him. Poseidon, sure, but not Zeus. It is Zeus's patronage, after all, that he invokes against the Cyclops. But, knowing what we know that Homer has told us about the rest of the epic, we know that the will of Zeus and the will of fate at this point are probably about synonymous. And that makes much more sense in figuring out what Odysseus means when he says that Zeus plotted disaster on them. Even though we are only familiar with this concept as a development in Homer's understanding of the gods, it shows up in Odysseus's voice because Homer is still writing the story. That's not to say that Odysseus's account is untouched by bias, so we'll discuss at the end of chapter 12 how much we really believe of his story. In the very beginning of the chapter, Odysseus refers to all that he has been treated to in Phaeacia as the crown of life, the best that life can offer. But if that's the case, why leave? After all, he's been offered the hand of a beautiful princess, and he's worshipped like a god in some ways. He qualifies his statement a little later on. So nothing is as sweet as a man's own country, his own parents, even though he settled down in some luxurious house, off in a foreign land, and far from those who bore him. It is the same reason that he leaves Calypso's island. His needs may be met, he may be living in luxury, the women may be even more beautiful than his wife, but it's still not as appealing to him as his true home in Ithaca, with his father, his son, and his wife. This is why he claims that despite Calypso's and, as we will see, Circe's attempts to keep him back, however warm, they never won the heart inside me. Never. This is important to remember. Odysseus wants to go home more than anything else, even if he finds places where he can live in luxury and peace along the way. Whether that was always the case for him, though, we will have to see. With all that said, let's take a look at how Odysseus presents himself in the past. He begins his story with the sacking of Ismarus, which, as I've been over before, is not necessarily something that he would have felt the need to hide. Piracy was not considered criminal at the time of the story, and may have even been considered honorable, depending on the context. We can even see this in the Cyclops' casual greeting regarding piracy, which matches the wording of Nestor's from Book 3. Out on a trading spree or roving the waves like pirates? Sea wolves raiding at will? Who risk their lives to plunder other men? This part of his story would not have been seen as a humble confession of wrongdoing to his audience. Instead, I think the point of telling this part of the story, probably for Homer as well as for Odysseus, is to display his characteristics of leadership, his fairness, his good sense. Odysseus tells us that after the city was looted, that rich haul we dragged away from the place. We shared it round, so no one, not on my account, will go deprived of his fair share of spoils. Then I urged them to cut and run, set sail, but would they listen? Not those mutinous fools. In one stroke, he establishes himself as a fair, but also sensible leader, while his men are the ones who may be jealous sometimes, or may not have the good sense to follow his orders. Thus, they are responsible for the losses that occur along the way, at least some of them. He also tries to establish himself as a moral leader, and an honorable one. He insists that the fallen among them are given a salute before the survivors sail away from the city. He goes on to save his men from the Lotus Eaters by hand, and in the books to come we will see many other examples in which he takes it upon himself to save his men. We're meant to see that he cares about them and wills their good, despite the fact that they're foolish and disobey him sometimes. But couldn't this just be bias? Possibly, but Odysseus doesn't really gloss over his own mistakes either. Look at how he talks about the mistake he made when approaching the Cyclops' cave. Comrades pressed me. Let's make away with the cheeses, drive the lambs and kids from the pens to our swift ship, put out to sea at once. But I would not give way. And how much better it would have been. Not till I saw him, saw what gifts he would give. But he proved no lovely sight to my companions. Odysseus' biggest mistake on this island, though, occurs a little bit later on, and it reveals much about who he is, especially his flaws. The encounter with the Cyclops is a textbook example of what Knox would point out to us as a bad host, one who does not honor the laws of hospitality, the rights of a guest, the duties of a host. Part of why he is this way is because there are no laws in the Cyclops' land. We are told that each one is a law unto himself, rules his wife and his children by himself. They don't meet for counsel. They don't have the typical characteristics of human society. Thus, it makes sense that in addition to not fearing the gods, as communities and individuals would, they also don't honor the customs that are presumed within peaceful society. The interesting thing about the encounter between Odysseus and the Cyclops, though, is that they both make the exact same mistake. When Odysseus first speaks to him, he does not identify himself, except as a suppliant and as a guest under the patronage of Zeus, who will avenge him if he is mistreated. Respect the gods, my friend. We are suppliants at your mercy. Zeus of the strangers guards all guests and suppliants. Strangers are sacred. Zeus will avenge their rights. The Cyclops, however, voices quite bluntly that he and his kind do not fear the gods, downplaying their power and their ability to avenge him. You must be a fool, stranger, or come from nowhere, telling me to fear the gods or to avoid their wrath. We Cyclops never blink at Zeus. We've got more force by far. I'd never spare you in fear, unless I had the urge. The Cyclops' mistake is twofold. Number one, he doubts the gods' power to bring justice against him. And number two, he picks a fight against Odysseus without knowing who he truly is, or his name. Once he does find out, too late, he says this, "Oh no, no! That prophecy years ago! It all comes home to me with a vengeance now. All this would come to pass someday, that I'd be blinded here at the hands of one Odysseus." At this point, though, Odysseus is making the exact same mistake. Polyphemus, the Cyclops, reveals his identity to him. "Come here, Odysseus. Let me give you a guest gift and urge Poseidon to speed you home. I am his son, and he himself will heal me if he pleases." Just as Odysseus claimed Zeus's patronage and threatened his vengeance, so Polyphemus claims Poseidon for the same thing. And to make matters worse, Odysseus also doubts the power of the god to do what is threatened. "Heal you? Would to God I could strip you of life and breath, as surely as no one will ever heal your eye, not even your earthquake god himself." And you know, maybe it would have happened anyway, but it's only at this point that Polyphemus then curses Odysseus by his father, a curse to never come home, or if he is fated to come home alone, late, broken, and with plenty of trouble in his house. All of this comes to pass, and almost all of it is because Odysseus could not stand to be nobody, as he claimed to, in order to escape. Knox tells us that being nobody was difficult for Odysseus, even though he's a master of deception. It's something that his whole nature rebels against. It is for his name and all that it means to him that he struggles to go on living and return to the world where it is known, to which he must be true. He can't stand to get away without the Cyclops knowing that he's more than nobody. And yet, I think that even by the standards of ancient Greek martial virtue, which is what Odysseus is operating under right now, where glory earned is everything, revealing his name is still reckless. After all, his men presumably understand the desire of glory, but they are the ones that tell him not to taunt the giant. So, for the first time, Homer presents a warrior glorifying himself over the one he has defeated as a mistake. Not a crime or a sin, mind you, for even though both Polyphemus and Odysseus were foolish, only the Cyclops is guilty of violence against guests. But it's still significant. This is part of a gradual shift over the course of Odysseus' journey in his own character, starting from one that sees glorifying himself as best and ending with one that sees moderation as best, as King Alcinous does. And it is this shift that defines Odysseus' heroism as distinct from that of Achilles, as it also distinguishes the Odyssey from the Iliad. But it's just getting started. We have so much more to see on that point. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw here, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Comment below anything that you found especially interesting, and we will discuss it. See you in the next video.